Okay, it's finally time to test the EVGA Z790 Classified motherboard like thoroughly from memory overclocking perspective. So most of you guys have been very interested in this whole motherboard launch, like what kind of frequencies can it hit with 2 memory sticks and especially with 4 individual memory DIMMs running at the same time. I recently purchased 2 brand new G.Skill TridentZ memory kits that are based on the Hynix ADI memory IC. The other one of the kits is a 7200 CAS34 based kit and the other one is a 7800 CAS36 based kit. So I will start with 4 DIMM memory overclocking, as that is probably the biggest highlight of this video, like see what kind of numbers can we achieve. To be honest, I haven't seen any good daily stable overclocking demonstrations with 4 DIMMs now on this DDR5 generation. I would assume most of the 4-slot motherboards are stuck to somewhere around like DDR5 6000, maybe even less than that. I haven't seen any like 7000 or higher than 7000 runs with 4 DIMMs running at the same time. Once I get all of that sorted out, I will move on to 2-stick memory overclocking, as I was able to demonstrate DDR5 8600 already in tests like Geekbench 3 and ADA64, which was pretty much at the same level where I got with the DARK KIngPIN. I would assume the maximum daily stable overclock on the Classified with 2 memory sticks only will be somewhere between DDR5 8000 and 8200, depending on the quality of the IMC of your CPU and the particular memory kit you wish to use. So if we get in that range, so that means between 8000 and 8200, then the motherboard is pretty much on par with the DARK KIngPIN from daily stable overclocking perspective. So will be very interesting to see. This time around the Classified is definitely more interesting than ever. So on the previous generations the Classified didn't really seem that interesting compared to the DARK KIngPIN, but on this generation the Classified could actually be the more interesting option of the 2. So stay tuned for it. I will start right away. So 4 DIMM memory overclocking, let's start with that part first, and yeah, let's see what kind of numbers can we actually achieve. Okay, so instead of making like endless amount of trial and error with this whole system, as this whole overclocking experience with 4 individual Hynix ADI memory DIMMs has been extremely difficult. It actually took me a lot of time to get 4 DIMMs actually posting. So I started with the green sticks like before, but I didn't have that much good luck with those. And now I had a lot better experience with these 4 G.Skill TridentZ Hynix ADI sticks, and I already did some pre-testing to make the video a little bit shorter and just giving you the the final outcome of this whole testing. So I used all of the available cores on the CPU, so all of the P cores as well as all of the E cores, as you can't really test more than 60 GB of memory in HCI Memtest without having more than 8 cores. So if you want to test the entire capacity of the memory, you have to keep at least some of the E cores available. So 5.5 on the P cores, 4.9 on the cache, add-on cores at 4.4 to 4.5 and 1.27 volts. But of course that's not really the highlight of this whole thing. Then you need the extreme voltage mode enabled to be able to go higher than 1.435 volts on the memory, which is usual. It's the same thing on the DARK KIngPIN as well. I'm pretty sure you don't need any of these other settings like FLL override and so 1.35 volts on the V core or whatever value your CPU really needs. What was actually difficult was the VDDQ. So it was much harder with 4 DIMMs compared to 2 DIMM overclocking, because with 4 DIMMs it's very picky, or the system is very picky on the VDDQ voltage, and I will give you some insight on this once again. So once again, the best value was between 1.26 and 1.28. Sometimes values like 1.25 and 1.3 worked to some degree, but they were a bit more unstable compared to something like 1.26. If I tried to set 1.35, it would sometimes post, but then it would hang right at the Windows boot screen. When it tried to boot into the operating system, it just hang completely. And if I set the VDDQ to like values of 1.4, 1.45, 1.5, it generally wouldn't even post. And that's the same story for very low values as well. So I really recommend you keep this voltage somewhere between 1.25 and 1.3 volts. It has been the same story since Z690, so it hasn't really changed. But yeah, so for the memory, I didn't have that much success when I tried to post for the first time with the auto rules. Sometimes it would just load like too tight values, and I started with just XMP, keep the memories on the XMP profile, tried to post some settings. When I managed to catch the subtimings it usually trained, I just locked those subtimings like manually myself, and I managed to get like DDR5 7000 working. So that's what I will be trying right now with you guys, and I will be trying to do like close to 7200 in HCI Memtest with this actual configuration. For some reason, for the most part, for me, the 7200 multiplier doesn't work really well. Most of the time it will not post at all, or it's very difficult to post. Multipliers of 7000 and 7400 and even 7467, they usually post just fine. 7000 is great for like daily use, or if I want to aim for HCI Memtest stability, and if I want to do just some test type of overclocking, try to run Geekbench 3, 8064 and so on, multiplier of 7400 was pretty good. I tried up to 7600, but it didn't really want to post. So I will keep it at 7000, and I will just use the base clock in the operating system to raise the memory to 7200 on the fly. So that's something I will be doing. I don't know why the 7200 multiplier doesn't work so well. Maybe it's the IMC, maybe it's the BIOS, maybe it's the particular set of memory I'm currently using. Don't know, but that's what it is right now. Voltage is very picky once again. Higher doesn't mean that it's always more stable. When I tried to set memory voltages of like 1.5 plus with this kind of frequency, this kind of timings, it actually went worse. Most of the time it wouldn't even post, and if it did post, it was actually visibly more unstable inside the operating system. So good value on the voltage was generally between like 1.4 to 1.48 for the VDD. VDDQ either at the same voltage as the VDD or a tiny bit lower, like 20 to 30 millivolts lower than the VDD value. Now VPP we usually leave at auto, but I actually did feel it helped a tiny bit with this 4 DIMM configuration when I rose that value from the stock value of 1.8 to something like 1.95. So the possible cache latency or the main timings for this kind of configuration were as low as cache 31. So the odd cache latency values, they do work on the classified as well, and even with 4 DIMM configuration. When I started testing, I started at like cache latency of 36 or 35, but as these memory kits, they have like cache 34 to cache 36 on the XMP profile already, I wanted to make the whole experience a lot tighter with pretty nice frequency, as we can't even hit the XMP frequency of the other kit I'm currently using, as I'm mixing both 7200 and 7800 TridentZ kits together. So I wanted to aim for like 7000 to 7200 with cache latency of 31 or 32 in 4 DIMM configuration. So I went with 31, 45, 45 and 63. Sometimes I could go even lower on the TRAS, but the whole experience with the 4 DIMM configuration was that the TRAS has to be significantly more loose compared to just 2 stick configuration. So with just 2 sticks we could run values as low as like 38 just fine, but with 4 DIMMs I usually used at least values of like 42 to 48, and for this kind of HCI mem testing, as I want the whole thing to be as stable as possible, as this would be a daily stable configuration, or that's what I'm aiming for, it's better to leave the TRAS at a relatively safe value. Many of the subtimings were particularly hard to post, so sometimes it could actually take a few minutes for the rig to be able to post some very tight subtimings. So if you buy the classified motherboard and you buy like 4 individual sticks of Hynix ADI, no matter which brand, be prepared that the actual post process will be very slow compared to even some older platforms you have used over the years. So it can actually take some time to be able to post very high frequency and good timings on these DDR5 memory sticks in 2 DIMMs per channel configuration. So many of these settings I actually set manually once I found some very good settings based on the order rules. Some of the settings went too loose, some went too tight with the order rules, but technically or generally you cannot go anywhere near as tight on the subtimings with 4 individual memory DIMMs compared to 2 DIMM operations. So I went with 6, 8, TRTP and 4 active window. These were roughly the same as with just 2 memory stick configurations, so 16 and 23. Cache write latency at auto, which is usually determined by the cache latency you use. So if I set cache latency of 31, it will set the cache write latency down to 30. So a tiny bit under the actual cache latency we are running. Command rate 2, of course. And now these settings really start to get a lot more loose compared to just 2 stick operation. So for example, write recovery time 96 instead of something like 12 or 8 or 16 on with just 2 memory sticks. TRFC and this one, these are actually pretty tight for 4 DIMM operations, or they could probably go even tighter, but making them a lot more loose didn't actually give me a lot more headroom on the frequency. So these 2 actually set like this with the order rules, so I just locked them at these values manually by myself. Refresh interval, the highest available setting, is possible in test situations, but it's very likely to fail in HCI Memtests. So I locked the setting down to 20,000 for now, but the best or the highest performing option would be the max value of 262,143. These 2, just leave them at auto at first, and if they get set to good values, you can lock them to the values manually afterwards. TCKE, very loose once again. Usually with 2 sticks I use values ranging from 4 to 8. Now with 4 DIMMs I'm actually running a value of 27. On test situations I managed to go down to even values of 8 or so, but it's better to be a bit more loose to have some headroom for HCI Memtest. The hardest ones were definitely the third timings, so you cannot really go very tight at all on these settings. For example, first one, if I set anything tighter than 18, generally no post. Same thing for these 2 over here. I managed to do 20, but partially 22 was solid, but anything under 20 usually just failed. These cannot go very tight either, and the most annoying part was the last 2 of the third timings. These usually give the best yield from the third timings overall, and the best value we have generally used on these has been from 1 to 7. Usually people leave these at 4, but I couldn't go any tighter than value of 15 on both of these 2, which was kind of sad. But anyways, this overall configuration is pretty alright if you really wanted to run 4 sticks daily stable. So this is the configuration I will be trying at close to 7200. So let's give it a go, and I'll just do F10, save and exit. And okay, I managed to pass HCI Memtest, but very barely, at a frequency between 7000 and 7200. So this is very close to, or pretty much spot on 7200, but it's very difficult. 7000 is very straightforward and it runs, but once I get to something like 7100 or so, it gets very it's not so straightforward anymore, and it might sometimes pass and sometimes it will fail. So this is still a very good like outcome. So definitely good performance for the classified for 4 DIMM like memory overclock, but the overall experience when overclocking 4 individual memory DIMMs is completely different from like 2 memory stick overclocking. Like for example, the threads were all over the place, so some in between were much faster than the others. So that's pretty much it anyways. So this will be it. So between 7000 and 7200 for realistic like HCI memory test stability, and test wise 7500 plus is possible, and the highest I was able to see was 7600 in Windows when I tried to push even higher after getting the best score of 15,200 something in Geekbench 3 at 7550 or so with like cache latency of 31. So I actually do have that score over here somewhere still. So it should be this one over here. So this is around like 7550, cache 31, 45, 45, 48, command rate 2, 15,272. So pretty interesting if you ask me. Now as for 2-stick memory overclocking, I would assume the maximum in HCI Memtest would be somewhere between DDR5 8000 and 8200. I was able to do up to 8600 in various tests like Geekbench 3 and 8064, so I would assume the HCI Memtest stable like daily overclock would be at least somewhere around DDR5 8000, which is already a very good result for a 4-slot motherboard like this. So very close to the same range where I got with the DARK KIngPIN. The best I saw on the DARK KIngPIN in HCI Memtest was only like 8200, but I didn't push the voltage that high. So obviously you could do a bit higher if you really went much higher on the memory voltage, but it's not so easy actually in every situation. So you very often have to find the sweet spot on the voltage if you want to get some very specific frequency and timing table stable in HCI Memtest. But anyways, I will use roughly the same clock speed on the CPU, 5.4 for the P cores, 4.8 on the cache. I completely disabled the add-on cores as we don't need them for 2-stick memory overclocking. So we don't need more cores than 8 to be able to stress test up to 32 gigabytes of memory. If you want to test more than 60 gigabytes in HCI Memtest, you need more cores than 8 apparently. That's actually something new. I didn't know it before this whole experiment. So 1.35 volts on the V core, 1.26 on the VDD-Q once again, and memory DDR5 8000, and I'll move it higher with the base clock if we get any higher than DDR5 8000, and like 1.48, 1.49 on the VDD, 1.47, 1.48 on the VDD-Q, cache 35, 47, 47, 42. And most of these sub timings are set manually, and well, as we are only using 2 sticks at the moment, we can move many of the sub timings a lot tighter compared to the 4 DIMM operation. So for example, write recovery time of 12 instead of 96. TRFC is in the same range. We can also max out the refresh interval, which gives a very nice boost in many real world situations. So you can actually test it out yourself if you don't believe me. Try something like Geekbench 3, Ada64, maybe even some games. There will be a visible gain between some very low value of like 10,000, 20,000 and the maximum value of 262,000. These two either at 3 and 19 or auto, and TCKE at 4 to 6 instead of like 27. So much tighter secondary sub timings, and even the third timings are a lot better. The biggest highlight is on the last thirds, which are generally very important for performance. Now we can actually run like 4 and 4 and maybe even 1 and 1 instead of 15 to 16 on both of these two. So yeah, so I will try these and I'll just move higher on the frequency if it pans out all right. Okay, so when it comes to 2 memory stick overclocking, the end result was actually a tiny bit worse compared to what I expected at the start. So these are generally very picky on the stability, so the voltage has to be set like correctly. I assumed I could run close to 8200 just fine in HCI Memtest, but for some reason it always gets one error on one of the threads towards the end. So so far it seems that the maximum is somewhere between DDR5 8000 and 8100. Of course, that always depends on the memory stick and the IMC of the CPU you are using. So if you happen to get a very good IMC, if you get particularly good memory kit, maybe you could go close to 8200. But even this is already very, very good. So the overall difference between the classified and the DARK KIngPIN in HCI Memtest, like capable of memory overclock, is quite small in the end. So actually I'll try to load the voltage. This should be like a bit under 1.5 volts. So 1.48 VDD, 1.47 VDDQ, and the stock 1.8 on the VPP. So I didn't actually set it this time around. So let's save this, and that's pretty much it, I guess. So yeah, so the EVGA Z790 Classified is definitely an interesting motherboard launch this time around. So the difference between the DARK KIngPIN and the Classified was very small on this generation, probably smallest than ever. So I was actually surprised how well can this motherboard model overclock 2 very good quality Hynix A-die memory sticks on ambient cooling, considering that it's a 4-slot motherboard. As usually, the difference between 2-slot and 4-slot motherboards has been pretty high on the memory overclocking side of things, but I was actually able to do very close to the DARK KIngPIN levels on the Z790 Classified. Now, as the price difference between the Classified and the DARK KIngPIN is quite low, I would still go for the DARK KIngPIN if it's available and you are sure you don't really need the large DDR5 memory capacities you can actually run on the Classified. So if you really need between 64 gigabytes and 128 gigabytes of DDR5 memory, then you should go for the Z790 Classified. Yes, you can actually run up to 64 gigabytes on the DARK KIngPIN if you use 2 dual rank memory sticks, but it's still a very big question mark at the time of making this video, that how high can you actually overclock 2 very good quality Hynix A-die dual rank memory sticks. It's something I would like to test out myself, like in the very near future. So I'm actually planning to test some dual rank Hynix A-die at some point, but yeah, as I haven't really run them myself, I can't really answer that question with good like confidence, but I would assume you can run at least the same level what we hit with 4 DIMMs if you want to use dual rank Hynix A-die. So at least like DDR5 7000, but maybe close towards DDR5 8000. The DARK KIngPIN is definitely a bit better, at least in theory, on the memory side of things than the Classified. When it comes to CPU overclocking, you can be sure you will hit exactly the same end result on both of the motherboard models. So no difference on ambient cooling at least, and probably even on LN2. So you can still get pretty much the same end result on the Classified as well, on the memory as well, I mean. So what I managed to do was up to 7200 with 4 individual DIMMs in HCI Memtest, and that was with pretty good latencies as well. So cache latency of 31 and then 45, 45, 63, common rate 2, and up to 7550 in test scenarios, so in tests like Geekbench 3 and ADA64. So that's actually surprisingly good, as I haven't seen anyone else being able to do DDR5 7000 and above, at least in daily stable situations like in HCI Memtest, for example. I have seen like 1 or 2 test demos at DDR5 7000 with 4 DDR5 memory DIMMs. At least Gregory from Illinois was able to run DDR5 7000 on the EVGA Z790 Classified, but when talking about other Z790 motherboard models, I haven't really seen that much 4 DIMM tests going on. So it's actually a bit like new topic for the vast majority of users, like how well can you actually overclock 4 individual DIMMs. Then 2-stick memory overclocking, at least DDR5 8000 is quite rock solid. If you happen to get very good IMC on your CPU and particularly good memory kit, then you can probably run more closer towards DDR5 8200 when you really fine tune everything, find the sweet spot voltages and so on. So it's actually very close on the levels I was able to do on the DARK KIngpin. On the DARK KIngpin, the best HCI Memtest run I was able to do with realistic voltages, that is, was close to 8200. This was at 8000. Then test scenarios was up to DDR5 8600 on the Classified, so that means Geekbench 3 and 8064. And the highest runs on the DARK KIngpin that I've seen so far have been close to DDR5 8800 with CPU on water cooling and just air cooling on the memory sticks. So yeah, pretty interesting. Many of these profiles will probably be added to the future BIOSes for the Z790 Classified, so definitely stay tuned for them if you are going to be buying the Z790 Classified. I will provide some links to important stuff related to this video, so like for example the EVGA Z790 Classified BIOS version 1.08, although it doesn't include any of the profiles I ran on this video. So it's pretty much the same thing as the current latest BIOS version 1.07, but I'll still probably add it to the description box anyways. But yeah, so give me a thumbs up and subscribe to my channel if you like to see these tests on the Z790 Classified. Maybe check out my Patreon page as well if you want to support my work. And yeah, thanks for watching one of my videos once again, and I will see you on the next one.